Our next speaker is Michael FitzGerald, who is professor of fine arts at Trinity College in Hartford. He received his PhD at Columbia, and he also has a degree from Columbia Business School. He worked for many years at Christie's in the Department of Impressionist and Modern Art, and that gives him an almost unique insight into art history as well as the art market. And that has been one aspect of his scholarly career, is to understand better the mechanism of the art market and how that informs the career of artists like Pablo Picasso. He himself has curated many exhibitions, a show in 1995 at the Whitney called Picassoid, and an extraordinary exhibition in 2006, Picasso and American Art. One of his best books, I think, is called Making Modernism, Picasso and the Creation of the Market for 20th Century Art. And he's also about to publish something that I'm looking forward to, A Life of Collecting, Victor and Sally Gantz, a collection of essays that he has edited. The Gantzes were New Yorkers and extraordinary collectors of both Picasso. They had a room full of those works after Delacroix, Femme d'Alger, as well as Jasper Johns Rauschenberg and others. Today he will speak to us on Picasso and America. Please welcome Michael FitzGerald.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's a great pleasure to be speaking in this very distinguished group. In talking about Picasso and America this afternoon, I'm going to focus on the collecting of Picasso's work, because in the case of Picasso, that's not so much a matter of one person or another acquiring one picture or another, but rather, to a large extent, the way in which modern art was defined in America, and that conception has passed into the museums of this country, including the Metropolitan. I'm starting here with two of the most famous pictures in the Metropolitan's collection, the portrait of Gertrude Stein that Madame Gillot showed, of course, painted in 1905 and 1906, and on the right, The Woman in White of 1923. And I begin with them because in many ways they suggest both the complexity and the contradictions in these ideas of modernism that have defined our sense of Picasso, and indeed of what modern or contemporary art might be. In the case of Gertrude Stein, as many of you know, she and her brother, Leo, were simply the most important collectors of Picasso's work anywhere in the world in the years before the First World War. And that's really quite amazing, that these two emigre Americans could have that importance. And it was tremendously important for Americans because the Steins were very accessible to those who had an interest in modern art and went to Paris in the years around 1910. It was relatively easy to get an invitation to their home, and if one went there, one saw not only their great collection, one heard Gertrude and Leo expounding about the wonders of Picasso as well as Matisse and Cézanne, but there was also a fair opportunity to actually meet the artists, Picasso or Matisse or others at this time. So it gave tremendous access to Americans. They heard over and over again, particularly from Gertrude, that it was Picasso who was the great genius of the early 20th century. And it was this idea, this discussion in the home of the Steins in Paris that to a very large extent planted the root of the admiration for Picasso as the foremost artist of the 20th century that continues to define many conceptions of modern art in America. Gertrude Stein obviously considered herself to be modern, and yet she famously said, "You can be modern or you can be a museum, but you can't be both." Now, in fact, this was not an unusual idea. It was a very common conception among those who admired the avant-garde in the early 20th century because there was a sense of a great divide between historical art and the contemporary, the modern, an unbridgeable chasm, really, that associated museums with the past rather than with the present. Nonetheless, Gertrude Stein, of course, willed her portrait to the Metropolitan Museum. She died in 1946, and it arrived at the museum in 1947. And it seems to me that she did that not so much to repudiate the historical collection of the Metropolitan, but to present herself and this painting by Picasso as its true culmination. Well, the portrait of Gertrude Stein and the woman in white lie on the two sides of Picasso's greatest achievement. Of course, Cubism that he developed with Georges Braque. Gertrude Stein leads towards it in the imposition of the archaic mask upon her face. In the case of the woman in white, its situation within conceptions of modernism is much less secure because it openly engages the art of the West going back to the Renaissance. The drawing of the painting is as fine as anything that might have been produced by Raphael or by Ingres. If you look, for example, at the depiction of the brow, or the line of the edge of the face and the cheek and the neck, and the way that is drawn so perfectly. And yet, this is a painting that is in many ways unexpected, unconventional, because it is not simply a painting of line. Indeed, the lines are themselves quite varied. Other marks, these great squiggles that suggest the fall of her hair, very different from the precise linear definition of her profile. But also because paint is applied in a very different way, in broad strokes or layers of paint that build up in opaque and transparent layers, and finally in this great wash of white that is often coarse and chalky. It's a technique that suggests the techniques of the old masters, but doesn't actually mimic them, that brings a painting that is both delicate and crude together with really a remarkable image that in many ways is more modern than much of what was being produced at this time. And yet it was also a challenge to those who saw modernism in a very different way. In 1923, the same year that Picasso painted this picture, he said in an interview, "If the subjects I have wanted to express have suggested different ways of expression, I've never hesitated to adopt them. Different motifs inevitably require different methods of expression." A very straightforward statement, and yet a radical one to modernists who had wanted to see modern art as something much more narrow, much more puritanical. And it is this tension, or this dilemma within modern art, that has a great deal to do with why the woman in the white is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. Before I get deeper into my subject, I want to touch on just briefly the remarkable exhibition that's in the galleries and that I hope you've all seen, and if you haven't, you'll go and look at many times. And particularly this one case of the portrait of Gertrude Stein, because of the materials available in the exhibition reveal a remarkable understanding of this work that I think none of us have really had before. What I'm showing you on the right is a radiograph, a photograph of the painting that can look through the layers of paint down to the base layer of the painting, to Picasso's original conception. And these radiographs are available within the galleries to look, and I very much recommend that you see them. What we find, I think, is that from the very beginning, Picasso had fixed his conception of how Gertrude Stein would be portrayed. And yet, in the process of the painting, it shifted. He found a radically new form to express that very same idea. What I'm showing you on the right is the radiogram that shows the first stage of the painting. Picasso began with this physical presence of Gertrude Stein, this amazing physical body that occupies the canvas and leans out towards us. And that remains throughout these presentations. But what changes is the rendering of her head. And what you can see in the gold here, and that I'm outlining in red, is the position of her head, particularly her face, in which the nose extends out, the mouth is shifted here, the line at the chin there. He originally conceived her almost in full profile. That is, the physical presence of her body, but the absence of her regard, her glance looking away from the viewer rather than toward. So it was a conception that mixed presence and absence within this portrayal. But what you find in the stages coming up to the final version, and I'm not going to show you each one of those, but you can see them in the galleries, is that over this course of many months, of many sittings, from late 1905 into 1906, the face is slowly moved. It slowly shifts from profile closer and closer to a direct confrontation with us and with the artist, as if she were turning and opening up to the audience. And yet then finally, as many of you know, after his period in Gossol in the summer of 1906, Picasso returned and he painted out that face and established the one that we have here. So in the final version, the face does very nearly confront us, as the previous version of the painting did, but as he affixed this mask, he has closed off her mind from us so that he has reinforced this idea of presence and absence that he began with, but something that is far more powerful, more psychologically focused, much more radical as a composition. So it really indicates the amazing development and innovation within this portrait. Well, as many of you may know, the Metropolitan Museum was founded in 1870. But you may not know that from the very beginning, contemporary art was a part of its program. The original board of trustees included prominent American artists at that time, particularly Frederick Church and John Frederick Kensett. I'm showing you here two of Kensett's landscape paintings, The Gathering Storm on Long Island Sound on the left, and on the right, the Newport Rocks, both of 1872. Both of them were given to the Metropolitan Museum in 1874 and became a part of the collection. Now, these are contemporary art in America at this time, but they are clearly works that accept being a part of a tradition that laps back to the 17th century, and particularly to the work of Claude Lorrain. I was going to use these two works, which came to the Metropolitan Museum in 1889, Monet's Woman with the Parrot on the left, and Bastien Lepage's Joan of Arc on the right, to show the developing conception of modernism in the later 19th century within the Met's collection. But in the interest of time, I think I'll move on into the early 20th century. And to the beginning of the 20th century, when the Metropolitan really began to engage in what we think of as modern art, or the avant-garde. In 1913, the Armory Show occurred in this country. It was by far the largest presentation of modern art, both European and American, that had occurred in this country, and it was exhibited in New York, Chicago, and Boston. Of course, Marcel Duchamp's new Descending the Staircase, which you see on the right, of 1912, was the signature work, the most scandalous work of this exhibition. But in fact, it included many other works of the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist era, and particularly a very important group of Cézanne's work. It was a result of seeing this that the Metropolitan's curator of painting, Bryson Burroughs, decided that he would acquire a painting by Cézanne for the museum. Now, Bryson Burroughs is an interesting figure, so I'll take a moment to try to characterize him. I think it indicates something of the difference between the life of the curator at the beginning of the 20th century and the curator's life now in the early 21st. Bryson Burroughs was a painter, and I think one might say primarily a painter. He organized his work schedule so that he had each morning free to paint, and then he would come in the afternoon and transact what necessary business there might be for the museum. So he clearly had his priorities straight. I think perhaps because he was a painter, he became deeply interested in Cézanne's work and decided to make what was really a radical acquisition, to buy one of these Cézanne paintings for the museum's collection. And he knew he had to do it in a very subtle way. He decided to present it to the acquisitions committee in the summer when some of the more difficult trustees had left for the summer. And he got it through. But as a result of that, he very nearly lost his job. You have to remember, in 1913, Cézanne had been dead for only 7 years. And this was the first Cézanne to enter an American museum. So it really was a radical break. Well, of course, Duchamp's new Descending the Staircase descends from Cubism, from the work of Picasso and Braque and Picasso were represented in the Armory Show. But in fact, a painting by Picasso had been in America in a very important place already 4 years before the Armory Show. I'm showing you here that small Picasso on the left, and on the right, a painting by Max Weber, who was the acquirer and the one who brought it to New York. I say this is a small painting because while it looks quite large on the screen, it is actually tiny. It is 8 inches tall by 10 inches across. a small painting on a wooden panel in a series that Picasso made in the fall of 1908. Just before Weber left Paris, he had been there for 4 years, to return to New York, he assembled a small group of works that would be his talismans of the modern, of the avant-garde. He knew Matisse, so he brought back a small painted tile of Matisse. And he went to Picasso's studio and he bought this small picture. This is all he could afford. We think of collectors being fabulously wealthy, but in fact, some of the most important collectors are very poor. They're the artists who understand, who get there first, who can explain and can transmit ideas. And that's exactly what Weber did. He came back to New York. He took this painting to the center of the art world in America, really at that time, to Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz, who was the publisher of the primary publication in America, Camera Work, who ran the primary gallery in New York, 291 for the address 291 Fifth Avenue in which the gallery existed, and who was arguably the most important artist in America in the early 20th century. But Stieglitz didn't know Picasso's work. He had never met him. He had spent very little time in Paris. But through his contact with Weber and through his contact with that little picture, Picasso became the primary artist for Stieglitz. And it was in 1911, 2 years before the Armory Show, that Stieglitz presented the first exhibition of Picasso's work in this country. If you think of it then, from 1911 to 2010, we are in the centenary of the exhibition, the public exhibition of Picasso's work in this country. It was a result of this then that Stieglitz presented this landmark exhibition, which included 83 drawings. The most notorious, and probably one of the very best, is the standing nude figure that you see on the left, that of course is in the Metropolitan's collection. I show you a photograph on the right of Stieglitz in his gallery. Stieglitz had to depend on the advice of others in presenting these exhibitions, and in this case, he particularly depended on the advice of Edward Steichen, himself, of course, a great photographer who was the primary scout in Paris, directing exhibitions to Stieglitz. When Steichen wrote to Stieglitz proposing this exhibition, he described it as a red rag to the public, something that would create tremendous sensation, as indeed it did. And he also described this particular drawing, and he described it as certainly abstract, nothing but angles and lines that has got to be the wildest thing you ever saw. Steichen admitted he really couldn't make any sense of it, but he knew it was important and it would be fascinating. Of course, it's not abstract. It is a standing nude woman. You can see her head, neck here, the shoulders, an arm cocked at the elbow, extending back, a hip here, a break of the knee here. All of the anatomy is there in this very challenging language of Picasso at this time. Well, Stieglitz had a field day with the exhibition in the gallery, and he also came up with what seems to be a crazy idea. He decided that this entire set of drawings, 83 drawings, should be acquired for the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. Now, that's outlandish, but in fact, it wasn't entirely crazy, because just the year before, Mrs. Blumenthal, one of the primary donors to the museum, had gone into Stieglitz's gallery and purchased 3 drawings by Matisse for donation to the Metropolitan. And therefore, Stieglitz thought, well, if you can have a few drawings of Matisse, why not a great many of Picasso? It's a possibility. So he presented this to Bryson Burroughs. And at least as Stieglitz remembered it, Burroughs said that he saw nothing in Picasso, and he vouched that such mad pictures would never mean anything in America. Well, of course, that's a rather poor judgment, but we have to remember that this is a remembrance on Stieglitz's part many years later, and that Stieglitz had a tendency to inflate things a bit if it made a good story. Whatever the case, Stieglitz did buy this drawing for himself, and he held it as one of his talismans, rather like Weber's little painting was to him. But I think there's reason to believe that the Metropolitan was forgiven for not having acquired all of these works in 1911, because in 1949, when Stieglitz's widow, the great artist Georgia O'Keeffe, came to distribute his collection of Picasso and Stieglitz's own work, she gave this drawing, along with another and much of Stieglitz's work, to the Metropolitan Museum. Now, that may be about forgiveness. It may also be about their attitude to the Museum of Modern Art and its approach to American art, but that's a subject for another lecture. So Stieglitz depended on others. I show you on the left a photograph of Picasso in his studio taken in 1910, and you can see hanging above his head that standing female nude, the drawing that, of course, was then sent off to New York, an indication that it was an important drawing for Picasso, not just for the Americans who saw it. Now, Steichen was the lead scout, but the person who ultimately had the greatest impact on that exhibition, and I think one can fairly say the greatest impact on the development of Picasso's reputation in this country before the founding of the Museum of Modern Art, was a man who is unknown to most of us. His name, you see him here on the right, is Marius Desires. He was of Mexican origin. His father had been a publisher, and they fled to New York to escape political persecution. He grew up here. He became an artist, but also a critic and a dealer, and it was ultimately in those later roles that he had his greatest contribution. You see him in a photograph taken by Stieglitz around 1915, and he is presented between his two greatest interests. On the left, African masks. He was one of the first to organize an exhibition of African art in this country and to write about it in extremely complimentary ways. And on the left, on the floor, an etching of Picasso's Frugal Repast. One of those prints is in this exhibition as well. And it was African art and Picasso who were really the poles of Marius Desires' great interest. And he developed this respect for Picasso in a very different way than what we tend to hear from Stieglitz or from Gertrude Stein, who tended to simply proclaim Picasso's genius without really explaining what it was constructed of. Marius Desires took a very different approach. He not only helped choose the drawings for that first show in 1911, but he wrote the pamphlet that accompanied the exhibition that introduced Picasso to America for the first time. In writing about Picasso, he emphasized something that very few writers paid any attention to then, or really often later on as well. He emphasized that Picasso was Spanish. Of course, as a Mexican, they shared the Spanish language and Hispanic heritage, and this was something that was very important to Desires at this time. It was also tremendously important for Americans in general, because what it said was this artist from Spain, and Desires said not only that he was from Spain, but that he was from Malaga, from the very southern part of Spain. This outsider then, from the center of Europe, could rise to be one of the most respected artists in Paris. This was a remarkable achievement, but of course it suggested that if Picasso could do it from Spain, perhaps an artist from New York could do it as well. There was the possibility of America entering the avant-garde through this particular door. So I'd like to read you just two brief sections from Desires' text that introduced Picasso to America. He said, "I have studied Picasso, both the man and his work, which is not difficult, for he is a sincere and spontaneous man who makes no mystery of his ideals, nor the method he employs to realize them." You see, there's no hyperbole here, no promotion. And then he described the process of this very austere stage of analytic cubism that they encountered in Picasso's work. He said, "Picasso receives a direct impression from external nature. He analyzes, develops, and translates it, and afterwards executes it in his own particular style, with the intention that the picture should be the pictorial equivalent of the emotion produced by nature. In presenting his work, he wants the spectator to look for the emotion or idea generated from the spectacle and not the spectacle itself." It's really a remarkably sophisticated conceptual statement of what Cubism was, but it's also something that's very difficult to take in, something that was really too sophisticated for most observers in Paris, let alone in New York. But I think you can see why Alfred Barr so admired Desires and respected what he accomplished in the years before the modern was created. Like other artists, like Weber, like Hartley, like Dove, Alfred Stieglitz was deeply impressed by Picasso's work, and he assimilated Cubism into his own. And this is, to me, one of the most interesting comparisons. The photograph by Stieglitz on the right, out the back door of 291, looking over the evening scape of New York City, is also in the Metropolitan's collection as a result of O'Keeffe's gift. This evening view, in which the strict architecture of the city is softened by the shadows of the night, the forms more obscure, is its own equivalent to what Picasso is doing in his charcoal drawing, also made up of simple geometric line segments, but clouded over by the shading of the charcoal to create an extremely ambiguous spatial construction. So you can see the way Picasso is already influencing artists like Stieglitz and others, as many others were. Well, and this, by the way, is the three women at the fountain that Madame Gillot mentioned, just if you want to put that in your mind. Picasso's painting of 1921. Not only Bryson Burroughs was inspired by the Armory Show, so were many, or some at least, American collectors, and particularly John Quinn, who had helped organize the show in the first place, and in the years following the Armory Show became not only a great collector of post-impressionist art, but by far the most important collector of Picasso in America, and quite possibly the most important anywhere in the world in the early 1920s. I show you here a photograph taken in the summer of 1921 when Quinn was visiting Picasso in Fontainebleau, where Picasso painted the three women before the fountain, along with the three musicians that Madame Gillot showed as well. You see Quinn standing here. Of course, here's Picasso and his wife Olga. In the background is Jean Foster, who was Quinn's longtime companion. Just a few months later, in 1922, Quinn bought the three women at the fountain and brought it to New York. So it was one of the great pictures here in the early 1920s. In this same year, in 1921, when Quinn was visiting Picasso, Burroughs decided, with the urging of Quinn and Lily Bliss and Mrs. Whitney, three of his most important patrons, to organize a large exhibition of Impressionist and post-Impressionist art. But Quinn and his friends particularly urged this not be simply an exhibition of 19th century art, but that should be of 20th century art as well. And as a result of their pressure, which was quite extreme, two works by Picasso were included. One of them, The Woman Combing Her Hair of 1906, that you see on the right, which was lent by Quinn himself. Of course, it's now in the Museum of Modern Art. I can show you where it hangs in the photograph on the left, but I think you'll just have to believe me. It's this painting right here. What I think you can see is that there was an incredible array of Cézannes lent by Lily Bliss, particularly the standing male figure that's now in the Moderns collection there prominently on the board, and I would say of 20th century art. In fact, the most innovative picture here was not a Picasso, but it was this picture here, which is Matisse's Italian Woman of 1915, which is now in the collection of the Guggenheim. So it was in 1921 that the Picasso, at least on a temporary basis, first entered the American museums. But in fact, the Metropolitan show was not quite the first. They had been scooped by just a couple of months by the Brooklyn Museum, the other major museum in New York at that time devoted to art. And it had a much larger group of Picasso's work, so it was really, in that sense, much more avant-garde. In fact, there was a proposal at that time by the director of the Brooklyn Museum that he and the Met's director collaborate, and that they split the art world between them, that the Met would take the historical works and that the Brooklyn Museum would take the modern. The director of the Met didn't respond, presumably keeping his options open, but as we'll see, that idea will come back again. Well, very sadly, John Quinn died prematurely in 1924, and he specified in his will a couple of things. One was that the vast majority of his collection would be sold at auction. It would be dispersed by the market. He reserved two paintings by Puvis de Chavannes that could be purchased by the Metropolitan Museum, but were not given to the museum. And then he gave one painting to a museum, Seurat's great painting, The Circus from 1890 that you see on the left. But he gave it to the Louvre. He sent it back to Paris, And if my memory is correct, it was the first painting by Seurat to enter the French National Collection. So it was a major event on that side of the Atlantic. But as you can imagine, there was outrage. He had not given his collection. His belief was that it wouldn't have been accepted if he had done that. But the art world, those who were the promoters of modern art, saw a tremendous opportunity here. And they wrote and editorialized about the possibilities of acquiring these pictures en bloc for a museum. So they were particularly upset when, as the sale was approaching in 1926, Picasso's dealer in Paris, Paul Rosenberg, swept into town and bought his entire group of Picassos. According to the New York Times, there were 52 Picassos in Quinn's collection. I think that's something of an exaggeration, but nonetheless, there were dozens. And not only then were these pictures bought rather than given, but they also were taken away from America and sent back to Europe. And that was simply intolerable to the supporters of American art, of art in America in the mid-1920s. The leading editor, the leading art magazine at the time, The Arts, Forbes Watson, wrote, "Heaven send New York a museum of modern art." This is in 1926. Clearly, his opinion and that of many Americans in New York was rather different from Gertrude Stein's. But they did think that there was a necessity now for a different kind of museum, something that would be devoted entirely to the modern, again, perpetuating this idea of a division between the historical and the modern that was the basis of Stein's views as well. Well, it was only 3 years later that the Museum of Modern Art was created in 1929, and it was out of this groundswell of activity, as well as, of course, the generosity of 3 women who were the founders of the museum. One of them, Lily Bliss, whom I mentioned before as a lender to the Metropolitan's Museum, Metropolitan's exhibition of 1921, died only 2 years after the founding of the museum in 1931. And she willed her remarkable collection of post-impressionist and 20th century art to the Museum of Modern Art. It was really its first great addition to the collection. It was 4 years later, in 1934, that all the legal work was finished and the museum actually took possession of those paintings. And the photograph on the left was made in 1934 to document that transfer. And what you see on the right is the attorney for Bliss. You can see he looks like a very serious negotiator who is handing over the deed to her collection to Conger Goodyear, the president of the board of the museum at that time. The rather young man standing behind him is Alfred Barr, who at this point had already been director of the Museum of Modern Art for 5 years, even though he looks like he's barely graduated from high school. Of course, hanging on the wall, the signature picture for the event is the woman in white. So you have to realize that originally, in terms of ownership by museums, the woman in white was owned by the Museum of Modern Art. However, Alfred Barr, who was tremendously broad in his interests and activities, was uncertain about the woman in white. For the mentions that I've given before, the sense of it not being really a modern picture, a little too closely related to an evocation of historical styles, not being tough enough, you might say, in a fairly simple avant-garde way. So in the later 1940s, when the Museum of Modern Art sat down and discussed with the Metropolitan their 2 collections, there was a decision, rather like the idea of the Brooklands director in 1921, that there would be a division historically, that the historical works would go to the Metropolitan Museum and that the modern ones, the ones that were really still current and challenging, would be at the Museum of Modern Art. It was as a result of that that Barr made the decision to sell the woman in white to the Metropolitan, to declare it a historical picture, you might say, rather than a modern one. Now, he came to regret that, and I think he came to realize that, in fact, it was an extremely avant-garde picture, that the sense of enclosing both the past and the present, this really quite outlandish combination was something that offered much more to the future than those more conventional, more limited views of the modern. But nonetheless, it has remained in the Metropolitan's collection. The director of the Met at that time, Francis Henry Taylor, had a great interest in Picasso's work. Unfortunately, he did not develop that into the acquisition of pictures. And it was really in these years, from the late 40s through the 50s and the 60s and much of the 70s, that the Metropolitan missed the opportunity to acquire many remarkable pictures. And it was in those years, really, that the modern was making its acquisitions. You have to realize that 10 years into the history of the modern, in 1939, they owned only 8 paintings by Picasso. Now, one of them was the Demoiselle d'Avignon that had just recently been acquired, but nonetheless, only 8 pictures. And even in France, in the national collections, there were only 2 or 3 works by Picasso, and they had more or less been forced upon the government. It was only in 1947 that France was given a gift of 10 paintings by Picasso himself, and that is when they began to have an important group of Picasso and to begin to develop a collection. This is an episode that Madame Gillot has described with great interest in her life with Picasso. So it's not so unusual to have a very small group of Picassos at this time in the 1940s, but after that is really when everything expanded tremendously. It was also at that time, just to give you one more permutation of these twists and turns between the historical and the modern, that the portrait of Gertrude Stein, having come to the Metropolitan Museum in 1947, was loaned back to the Museum of Modern Art. The sense that while the woman in white might be a historical picture, even though it was more recent, the portrait of Gertrude Stein was older but the more modern picture, and so it belonged downtown. Now, that's the way it stood for a number of years until the heir to Gertrude Stein's collection, her lover Alice B. Toklas, found out about it and was outraged and demanded that the painting be taken back from the Museum of Modern Art and brought back to the Met, where it has remained one way or another since that time. All of this changed at the Met in 1979 when William Lieberman came as curator of modern art. And I show him here on the left in this photograph taken, I think, in 1998. Bill Lieberman was a remarkable figure with a long career before he came to the Met in 1979, indeed going back to Gertrude Stein herself. He had begun working at the Museum of Modern Art in 1943, and his specialty really was Paris, knowing the artists, the collectors, the dealers, the art world in France in a way that probably no one else did. And of course, as a result of that, he knew Gertrude Stein in her later years, and he came to be a great friend of Alice B. Toklas after Gertrude Stein's death. So it was Bill Lieberman who was engaged when a remarkable opportunity came up in 1961. Word came out that the collection that Gertrude Stein had left to Alice B. Toklas, all of her great Picassos except for this portrait, might be for sale. Alice B. Toklas was ill, was getting old, and there might be a need to raise cash. So immediately, the Modern sent Bill Lieberman over. He examined the works, he worked out a price, he sent word back, and 4 trustees of the Museum of Modern Art, plus one friend, pooled their resources to make a pot of $6 million and bought the collection lock, stock, and barrel. You know, before it hit the market, before anybody knew that it was for sale, they had taken the single greatest collection of Picasso in existence at that time. The only requirement was that each of these 5 men give at least one of the pictures they bought back to the Museum of Modern Art. This couldn't have happened, I don't think, without the interventions of Bill Lieberman, of his sense of how to work with all of these individuals. It's simply one reflection of his mastery of the art world that he brought to the Metropolitan when he came there in 1979, and the great breadth of his interests that were demonstrated in what he did there. In this photograph with Lieberman is Natasha Gelman, who with her husband Jacques gave the greatest collection of 20th century art to the Metropolitan, 85 works, 14 of them Picasso's, that came in 1998. And on the right, David Deakins, who was mayor of the city at that time, a reflection of how important the gift was to the city as well. Before I look at the Gelman gift, I'd like to mention that one that happened the year before in 1997 by Klaus Pearls and his wife Dolly, 6 Picassos. I'm showing you just these 2, which are grouped around the year of 1930, the time in which Picasso was deeply involved in surrealism and its investigations of the imagination and the sense of the root of nature. These 2 pictures lie to either side of that time. The one on the left, perhaps initially the least engaging, is to me one of the most fascinating. A painting of Harlequin done in 1927. Of course, Harlequin, a long-standing alter ego of Picasso, and you can see that it is a Harlequin. For example, you have the diamond pattern here on what would be the left shoulder of the man. Here is his neck and the other shoulder, also the rounded hat that he would wear, and we see him with his head thrown back and his mouth wide open. The underside of his nose and his 2 nostrils here, the mouth open with the teeth showing as well. But we have not only one alter ego of Picasso, but multiple personas that emerge in this shadowy space. For example, if you follow the L, which would be the mask, we have one eye on this side, another here, it becomes the eye of another profile, the nose extending out here back around to the mouth, the chin and the neck, and the ear there. And beyond that, within the shadow world of the Harlequin, if you follow the shadow, following across the frame and down to the left, another profile is mapped up on the edge of that shadow, one that could possibly be that of Picasso, but I think is more directly that of Marie-Thérèse Voltaire, the young woman that Picasso had met in January of the year in which he painted this picture and who would soon become his lover, would be his muse for more or less the following 10 years. It is, of course, her image, her inspiration, that lies in these great figures of the reclining nudes, even her profile, exaggerated, of course, in this image that you find here, these great celebrations of sensuality and of fecundity. Well, two of the Gelman pictures, just 2 of the 14. On the left, a portrait of a man, part of a series in which Picasso was working up to his great self-portrait with palette that Madame Gillot showed. Also, on the right, a painting of a musketeer with nude from 1967. So we have 61 years between these 2 pictures, just a sense of the range of the pictures that are included within Gelman's collection. The painting of the man is one that's particularly interesting in relation to the portrait of Gertrude Stein, and it falls in the period in the summer when Picasso was trying to sort out that final rendering of Stein's face, because you see he's painted the eyes in very different ways. The eye of the man on the right has its iris that suggests a focus, a literal physical presence, whereas the eye on the left is blacked out, as if we were looking into that impersonal mask that he would finally use as much of the resolution of Stein and indeed of his own self-portrait. So it really shows another stage in the planning of that particular picture. In the case of the painting on the right, in 1967, when Picasso is in his 80s, tremendously virile, a painting of very powerful line, of exuberant color, of tremendous playfulness, and incredible achievement for someone in their 80s. Well, in the 1960s, Picasso's position changed once again within the history of art. He was not only the great figure of the first half of the 20th century, but he became the touchstone for younger generations of artists, particularly for Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg and those of their generation. The collectors who really typified that are the Ganses, whom Gary mentioned in his introduction. I show them there on the left, standing in front of their most famous Picasso, The Dream of 1932, that they had acquired in 1941. Through the 40s and the 50s and into the early 1960s, they were absolutely devoted to the collecting of Picasso's work. For example, buying the entire series of The Women of Algiers. But in the early 60s, they began to change, and they began to include particularly Johns and Rauschenberg in their work. And I'll show you on the right one photograph of their living room in which you see Jasper Johns' great drawing, The Diver of 1963, next to one of Picasso's paintings from the Second World War, The Still Life with Blood Sausage. And you have not only this dark tonality, but this very somber theme that really unites this work, that kicks off Picasso's importance for the second half of the 20th century, as well as for the first. Well, perhaps surprisingly, the Metropolitan was in the forefront of these developments. I'm showing you on the left a painting by Picasso from 1968, the seated nude, standing nude and seated musketeer, and on the right, a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat, a young artist called Chicken with Rice, also from 1981. The Basquiat is not in the Metropolitan's collection, but there are other works by Basquiat in the Met, and so I think it's legitimate to show it. The painting by Picasso is very characteristic of his last work. It was acquired by the Metropolitan as a gift in 1981, just 2 years after William Lieberman came to the museum, and is a reflection of his openness, his interest in aspects of Picasso's work that were not really highly regarded at this time. 8 years after Picasso's death, his late work was still very much suspect among many collectors and critics, but Lieberman was happy to acquire it for the Metropolitan and open up a new direction in collecting. It so happens that at that very time, in 1981, when he acquired this picture, Basquiat painted the picture on the right, and he and other young artists were themselves discovering this late Picasso. Picasso was becoming influential once again, and since that time, there have been waves of influence moving across the decades, and I think there's very likely one building right now. This Picasso is wonderful not only for its visual brilliance of color, but also the frenetic energy of the line, the straps across the back of the chair, the stripes across the boots, up across his vest, and then the curlicues that suggest his hair. A tremendous energy that moves through it, and also an absurd hilarity in the way in which the figure is characterized, because on the one hand, it's very jaunty. The musketeer's arm is thrown over the back of the chair, but if you look at it, sitting on the chair, we have only his two lower legs. His body has been shifted off to the left, as if he's sidling over to the standing nude who reaches up to stroke his cheek. So it's really totally impossible, and yet it holds together as a composition. One of the most interesting developments in what we call universal museums, museums of extremely wide-ranging collections like the Met, is that in recent years they have opened up to contemporary art, that they are extending beyond that, extending the ranges of the contemporary, which is really reshaping our understanding of historical collections as well as of the contemporary. And I might say even Gary's title suggests something of that. He is the curator of 19th century, modern, and contemporary art, suggesting those old divisions, but of course by combining them together into a single title, what one is really saying is that those divisions don't hold, that they are dissolving into a single historical continuity that one can work with in a great many different ways. One of Bill Lieberman's great interests, again, was another aspect of Picasso's work that was largely overlooked by serious institutions, and that was Picasso's involvement with ceramics. Not the additioned works that are fairly widely known, but unique pieces that had almost never been shown, works that he exhibited at the Metropolitan in an exhibition of 1998, and as the title of the work very fairly said, these are really paintings and sculptures in clay, rather than what tends to be a more diminished title of ceramics. Well, finally, two works in the Metropolitan's collection. On the left, a mask of the Dan culture coming from the western Ivory Coast, made around 1900, and on the right, Picasso's bust of a man from 1908, a painting that comes just 2 years after the portrait of Gertrude Stein, and of course extends the idea of masking now directly into African masks. In the 1950s, Nelson Rockefeller had created a museum of primitive art devoted to African and oceanic objects. It was really the counterpart to the Museum of Modern Art, but a distinctive entity, separate from it. In the 1970s, he closed that museum and in 1978 gave the collection to the Metropolitan Museum in memory of his son Michael, who had died in the South Seas on an exhibition. And this is really one of the wonderful things about the Met, the way in which it has grown and expanded. It allows us to see Picasso's painting in relation to the type of object that he was looking at and was so inspired by, but it also then allows us to study those African or oceanic works on their own in relation to their own culture. Picasso was fascinated by African art, but he used it for his own very particular purposes. Nonetheless, the fact that he and Matisse and other early 20th century artists were so fascinated by it has educated many of us in the West who are interested in modern art to the virtues of this art on its own, who have taken up the study of African or oceanic art within its own cultures. And indeed, one of the great legacies of the avant-garde is the breaking up of consciousness, the opening up of the idea of what art can be beyond the Western canon to include all of the cultures of the world. And it's really only a museum with the range of the Metropolitan that can reflect this diversity and that can capture the true character of historical, modern, contemporary art all through the world. Thank you.